It's hard enough to find the guts to say candid, hard things to people. And it's another thing to actually shut up and listen once you've asked for the candor. In this episode of Moments of Truth, I spoke with Kim Scott, author of the groundbreaking book Radical Candor. In her typical spirited, no-nonsense way, she shares her wisdom on how we can all get better at doing both. Take a listen. Today's guest is Kim Scott, author of Radical Candor. Kim, it's so great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. We have lots of leaders we all have seen in the throes of great change and turbulence and struggles. We've seen some leaders do it really well. We've seen some leaders do it poorly. In your experience, when you think about the importance of being radically honest during times of change, why is it important?
So I think being radically candid, and I call it radical candor because there's not a lot of humility in honesty, right? If I say, let me be honest with you, I'm kind of implying like I've got a pipeline to God and you don't know beep from Shinola. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to curse, but so I'll beep myself out. So anyway, I think one of the most important things to being a good leader through change is to be humble about what you do know and what you don't know, and to listen to those around you. Andy Grove said that snow melts at the periphery, that he was always the last person to know the important things. And if you can learn to be the kind of leader who's humble enough to go and find out what's happening out there and to listen to everybody who you're talking to, then you're gonna navigate these turbulent times much more easily.
So in your experience, when have you seen leaders, give me maybe contrast for me, when you've seen leaders be candid during times of change and what happened, and when you've seen leaders go to one of the other extremes, to ruinous empathy and try and overly caretake, or to being the jerk and just being blunt? And how does it not help change? What have you seen?
Well, one of the things that my husband says that I really admire is that people can tolerate change, but they cannot tolerate uncertainty. And there's a big difference. So one of the things that really works well is when you know you're headed into a period of change, to explain what you do know and to move forward very deliberately with what you do know. But don't leave people in great uncertainty. Don't leave people guessing. If you know something, say it. If you don't know it, say you don't know, and you're all going to figure it out together, so that people feel like they have some bit of control and insight into what's going on. One of the really interesting things that James March, who wrote a primer on decision making, said is that when people feel like they're excluded from decision making, they feel almost like a loss of personhood. And so the more that you can push decisions into the facts in a period of change, rather than try to grab control for yourself, I think that the better your organization is going to navigate that change. And I've been very fortunate. I've been at a number of high growth companies that have navigated the changes they were in very well, and been lucky to see a lot of leaders do really an exceptional job of helping people go through that growth process. Really simple example. At one point when I was at Google, things were just growing explosively. And when things grow explosively, there were some managers who tried to figure out how to not hear from people and not give people a voice. And then there were other managers who invited everybody to share in their opinion. And it was in the decision-making process, it was very clear what worked and what didn't work. So one of the things I saw Sheryl Sandberg do really well once was we decided we were going to do, often there were bug fix-it weeks at Google. We decided we would do a manager fix-it week. And so people filed bugs of all the things about management that were driving them crazy. And this was sort of demoralizing for those of us who were managers because there were a lot of like crazy things. And I remember there was the one recent college grad who had just joined the team stood up and explained how long it took him to file a ticket to go to the bathroom, right? Because somebody else had to cover for him. It took him 10 minutes to say, I've got to go to the bathroom instead of just going to the bathroom. And I remember Cheryl's expression, she was so astounded that this had happened in an organization she was leading, but she was listening so intently, and she was palpably grateful to him for telling her. And she just stood up and she said, I am so sorry. And then she looked at all of us, and she said, we will fix this. And we all knew we damn well better fix it quickly. So it was such a small example, but there's another example. There's very interesting case study about Johnson & Johnson. And there was a credo. And early on, the credo said that employees must have a process to make suggestions. And they changed the language. And later on, they said employees must feel free to. And, they didn't feel free. So there needs to be a speak truth to power process. And you could see what happened to the company when the shift from there's an actual process that makes it easy for people to air complaints versus there is there's an expectation that people feel free. They don't feel free.
Talk a little bit about, in a time of change, what are the actual risks or the liabilities if you stray too far to the extreme of being overly empathetic at the expense of honesty or overly blunt at the expense of tact? What can change?
Yeah. So I think here's one of the interesting things that I've seen as I've worked with companies rolling out radical candor. When a company is, so this is as a company grows, as times change for the company, early on in a company's history, people are kind of more naturally radically candid. It's a small group of people, and they know that if they don't tell each other when something's broken, that they're all going to go down together because it's small and fragile situation. And then as that yields good results, and as the company starts to grow and there's more people, there's a real temptation to be ruinously empathetic. So stage 2 in a company's growth is the temptation to ruinous empathy, because now all of a sudden there's all these new people at the company. You want to keep that culture of caring. And so rather than trying to move up on the care personally dimension of radical candor, people try to back off of the challenge directly dimension of radical candor. And it doesn't work very well. And projects start to fail, and people start to do badly. And then all of a sudden what happens is a couple of people are like, to hell with that. I'm just going to be a total jerk. I'm going to not worry at all about upsetting people. I'm just going to focus on challenging directly. And that's actually more effective, unfortunately, than ruinous empathy. So this is why I once said, if you can't be radically candid, the second best thing you could be is an asshole. And now don't take that out of context, because what I mean by that is nobody's shooting for second best. You should be shooting for radical candor, where you're challenging and caring at the same time. But obnoxious aggression, which is what happens when you challenge but you don't care, it works better than ruinous empathy. And so now all of a sudden, the people who are the biggest jerks start to rise to the top at this company as it starts to succeed. And the rest of the organization reacts with what I call manipulative insincerity, where they neither care nor challenge. And that's the death knell. That's the gravitational pull of organizational mediocrity right there, is that sort of manipulative insincerity, where you've got a few people who are effective because they are at least willing to have those direct challenges. And then you got the rest of the people who are neither challenging nor caring. And that's unfortunate.
People are probably more resilient and more able to handle bad news than we probably give them credit for if we would just deliver the bad news more respectfully.
Yeah.
So what advice, as leaders are about to embark on change, if the change is going to begin with not great news, what advice would you have for when you get into delivering the bad news, how to make sure that, you might get some blowback, but for goodness sake, don't cause it?
Well, I think your advice was really good. You've got 30 seconds. A long preamble is almost always going to feel patronizing. Almost always going to feel patronizing. And trying to predict how other people are going to react or feel is almost impossible. It's really, you've got bigger fish to fry than the impossibility of predicting other people's emotions. So I really think the best thing you can do is be super clear, super quick, and then make yourself totally available to react. There is a time as a leader where the best thing you can do is not try to control things, but be willing to react. It's more like jazz than a classical symphony, I think, because it's not a controlled environment.
So if I'm a leader and I've never done this before, I've never led any kind of significant change, I've never announced it, I've never constructed it, I've never brought people with me through it, but I'm about to begin. And my team of people, my department of people are in the next room, and I think I know what I'm going to say, and I get a hallway conversation with Kim Scott. Mm-hmm. What would you tell me before I walk in that room? What would you say? But here's the 3 or 4 things. Make sure this is what happens when you walk in that room.
I think the most important advice that I would give is don't forget that you are a human being and that you're talking to human beings. I think it's all very well and good to get some advice from lawyers and get some advice from PR people and communications people and whatever. But the worst thing that happens, and it happens all the time, is that you get wrapped around the axle of all of the terrible things that might happen as a result of this. And I remember the first time I ever had to do a round of layoffs. I remember talking to the corporate attorney. And I mean, my God, by the end of that conversation, she wanted people with Kalashnikovs walking it. Now, I'm like, these are my friends. Like, these are people who I like and respect and I've worked with for a long time. And I'm sending them into a hard situation. And the most important thing I can do here is treat them with respect. And if I treat them with respect, then I'm going to minimize the odds that something terrible happens. So it's exactly as you say. I think there's a biblical saying, that which I greatly feared has come upon me. I think it's from the book of Job. And it's almost like you create your worst nightmare by trying to prevent it. So another good thing to remember is what Mark Twain said. I'm an old man who's known many problems, most of which never happened. So I think the thing is, like, you're going to wake up on the morning that you have to deliver this bad news, and you're going to have a stomach ache. You're going to have a pit deep in your gut. And I think one of the best things you can do is share a little bit about how you're feeling too, but don't focus so much on how you're feeling. Focus on how your team is feeling and let them tell you how to feel. I remember one time, this was probably the moment when I got interested in management. I was very early in my career, one of my first jobs out of business school, and I was working at a startup, and the startup had to do a layoff. And the one of the leaders came in and told everybody how to feel. And I remember being so pissed off and making myself a really solemn promise. I'm never going to tell people how to feel because it's insulting and it's a waste of breath. So let people feel the way they're going to feel and react with compassion is that was a long-winded way of saying, don't predict how people feel. Let them feel the way they're going to feel and react to it with compassion.
Kim, as always, a thrill to talk to you. Love your rich, fun insights. Thanks for helping our listeners get through their turbulent change a little bit better. On this episode of Voices, Khalil Smith's guest is a true expert on empathy. Jamil Zaki is professor of psychology at Stanford University and the author of The War for Kindness. He studies empathy, writes about empathy, speaks about empathy, and in his conversation with Khalil, will touch on a number of topics related to speaking up, including how to find your authentic self and a touch of what the game of chess can tell us about leadership. Take a listen.
Jamil, thank you for taking the time to spend some time with me and with anybody who will have the fortune of watching this. I, as I've said before, have really just tried to bring together a collection of people whom I respect, people whom I learn a lot from, and people whom I think others will learn a lot from. And you are absolutely on that list of people that every time I talk with you, I take something away. A number of other people that I've chatted with have absolutely said, like, oh, by the way, Jamil's doing this or Jamil's doing that. So I know people will get a lot out of this conversation. But I would love it if maybe you could just kind of introduce yourself right out of the gate. And then we're going to talk quite a bit about speaking up and kind of finding your own voice. So what does that mean to you? How would you define it?
Yeah, well, first, Khalil, thanks for having me. And I would say the same about you. I feel like I learn so much every time we speak. I'm Jamil Zaki. I'm a professor of psychology at Stanford University. And for the last 15 years or so, I've been obsessed with human connection. How do we connect with each other? What do those connections do for us? Why are they difficult sometimes? And how can we get better at connecting? And I wrote a book on these subjects called The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World, that was published last year.
Awesome. So how do you think of voice or speaking up? Like what, because, and I've asked this question of a number of people and we'll continue to ask it of people. And I think in some ways it feels like such a simplistic question. And yet there are such varied and nuanced and really deliberate and personal answers to it. So I'm curious to get yours because I think that'll frame kind of the rest of our conversation.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of speaking up is how difficult it is. And maybe that's just because it's difficult for me. I've been conflict averse my whole life. I'm, what I suppose you would call a people pleaser. And, I want to care for people. I want them to be happy. And I want to have good relationships with them. And for a long time in my life, speaking up felt like it was anathema to that, especially if what I would say if I spoke up was something that might be painful to hear. I guess I was thinking of empathy, which is ironic because it's what I study, in the wrong way. I was thinking about empathy as protecting other people's feelings rather than building a relationship by saying what needs to be said. So I think that for many of us, that's the experience. Speaking up is hard work. For other people, it's extremely easy. And I think that's also a problem because it creates inequity, right?
Yep.
Sometimes folks who are really extroverted, maybe even a little narcissistic, end up dominating conversations, end up having their goals met because it's so easy for them to speak up. And maybe the people who are not speaking up are just the ones that we need to hear from most if we want to build equitable workplaces and an equitable culture that works for everybody.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think, there's so much power in you sharing that this doesn't come naturally for you, because I think for a lot of us, like, I've spoken to many people that are like, oh, Jamil's such a natural born speaker and he's got such great ideas and he's so well researched and I think that sometimes that can be really disconcerting for people that do struggle with it because it looks from the outside like you've just got it completely together and, oh my gosh, I could never be where Jamil is because it just doesn't come naturally for me. So I'm curious, what are some of the things that you've done to either kind of embrace some of that, the concern that goes along with that, or push through it, or how do you even think about it? Is it fighting against your nature, or is it kind of reorienting your nature? Like what's the trick or the series of tricks?
I think reorienting is a good term for it, right? So it's possible to, from the outside, have a very pristine and clear voice, one that seems to everyone around you like it's exactly where you want to be, and internally feel like, well, that's not everything that I wanted to say. That wasn't exactly authentic. And I guess authenticity for me is something that is a big part of finding one's voice, because we can find a voice that pleases the people in one room or another. But I think that it's sometimes harder to find the voice that really represents exactly what we feel, and that can actually make positive change. So I think for me, an interesting feature is that as I've found more of an internal compass, I think I've been more vulnerable as a speaker externally, right? So whereas before I was very probably more bluster, more curation of what I said. Now I think I allow things to be shaggier when I speak, both public speaking and also in one-on-one conversations. I try to learn something. I try to not know everything that will happen, which took a long time for me to accept. To let go of control over conversations and public speaking, and to let things unfold a little bit more naturally. So that's been part of the reorientation for me, is sort of letting go of some control to allow something new to happen in the room.
That's amazing. And so, obviously as a professor, you have students, you have collaborators, as you've written papers and all sorts of other things. I know you work with a number of corporations. How do you create that environment for others as well? Because some of what you're describing in terms of letting go and being a bit shaggier, I don't think it's out of the norm to say a lot of the folks that are at Stanford because they've achieved over and over and over again and done such incredible things. And a lot of the corporations that you work with are, they're science, technology, engineering, and math companies where people are, lifted up for being really brilliant. And so how do you create some of that space for people to speak up, but also make it okay for those kind of shaggier edges or the lack of bluster?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it depends on how we define brilliance, right? I mean, I think you can get to a place of a lot of achievement and a lot of productivity by really white knuckling through it and forcing everything to be under control. But is that really going to be the best that you can do, and the version of yourself you want to be? I think that sometimes when we let go and allow that vulnerability to seep in, we can be surprised that actually even greater things happen. Great things that are greater from even an external point of view, but that also feel more deeply meaningful and fulfilling. That's a sort of quest that I'm on right now, with varying degrees of success from day to day and hour to hour. When it comes to people in my own research group, and I think something that I often tell to leaders in all sorts of contexts is that it's if there's one dynamic that makes it difficult for people to find their voice, it's a hierarchical power dynamic. Right? Generally, the person in power has no problem speaking up and speaking their mind, and the person without it has a lot of problems doing so. So the question to me is, what do leaders do with that first move? And if they, with their first move, are deeply assertive and demonstrate this even false, potentially, confidence about how everything needs to go, well, then the people who work for them will either fall in line or imitate them. If instead a leader is willing to have their opening move be something that they don't know the answer to, something that they're struggling with, something that they wake up thinking about because they're excited about but don't know what to do with, then that can generate a conversation where you are creating a space where it's obvious that it's okay for each person to find their voice because you started with an authentic version of your own.
Please, please, please write the book Opening Move or First Move. I will buy it for every leader that I know because I love that term. I love that idea of what does a leader do first, and how does that create almost the reaction and the next moves that go along with that. But anyway, Jamil, honestly, thank you as always for the time. I knew at the beginning that I would get a lot out of this. I guarantee you I will be watching this conversation over and over again, and not for any contribution that I made, for sure. But I just, always enjoy connecting with you and always get a lot out of it. And I'm glad that so many others will have the opportunity to hear your insights and your reflections on speaking up, both as someone who is speaking up and continues to do it, and someone who's creating that environment for others. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
It's a total pleasure as always, Khalil.
All right, my friend. I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Be vulnerable. Nothing accelerates trust among a team more than a leader's self-disclosure. Acknowledging your shortfalls and asking for help, disclosing aspects of your life where you are uncertain or struggling, and admitting when you don't know something reveals your humanity, which is your greatest source of credibility. It also signals to your team that it's safe for them to bring their whole selves and their full voice to work too. How confident are you that people really know you as a human being, not just as a boss? What parts of you have you actively hidden from others? What is your fear of being more vulnerable in those areas? How openly do you talk about your weaknesses or struggles? Give it a thought. Till next time, keep leaning into your moments of truth so that you can be the example of what it means to be honest.